In 1915, a legal record linked to the Biltmore Estate was quietly altered. Not a fortune, not a building, a name. The change carried no public explanation, no court dispute, and no correction afterward. Yet it reshaped who was allowed to exist in the official history of one of America's greatest fortunes. This video examines how the legacy of George Washington Vanderbilt was quietly altered after his death, and why a single succession record dated between 1914 and 1915 suggests that the removal of an heir was not accidental, but a deliberate decision, one that protected the estate while obscuring the bloodline. What follows will show how and why that decision became permanent. In the years immediately following 1914, the United States was entering a period of transition. The Gilded Age had formally ended, but its power structures remained intact. Industrial fortunes still dictated social standing, private influence still outweighed public scrutiny, and the legal architecture of inheritance was designed less for transparency than for continuity. Wealth, once accumulated, was expected to survive intact, even if people did not. At the center of this system stood estates that functioned as institutions rather than homes. Among them, the Biltmore Estate was not merely a residence, but a symbol of permanence. Its land, its staff, and its legal structure reflected a broader belief shared by America's elite, that property represented stability, while personal ties were secondary, adjustable, and, when necessary, removable. When George Washington Vanderbilt died in 1914, the public narrative suggested a smooth transition. Newspapers focused on the magnitude of the estate, the architectural significance of the mansion, and the future stewardship of one of the most recognizable symbols of American old money. What they did not examine closely was the administrative aftermath, the months when records were finalized, trusts were clarified, and legal language quietly hardened into permanence. It is within this narrow window between late 1914 and 1915 that an inconsistency appears, not in a headline, not in a courtroom, but inside routine succession paperwork. A marginal notation, an incomplete reference, a name that appears without continuation, then disappears entirely from subsequent records. On paper, nothing dramatic occurs. No dispute is registered, no objection is preserved, and yet the lineage becomes indistinct precisely where it should be most defined. At the time, this kind of silence was not unusual. Elite families relied on discretion as a form of protection. The press, largely deferential to established wealth, avoided prolonged attention to internal family matters. Legal trusts, increasingly sophisticated by the early 20th century, allowed property to be managed, redirected, or insulated with minimal public exposure. Reputation was currency, and continuity mattered more than completeness. What makes this case different is not the existence of legal discretion, but its consequence. A preserved fortune paired with an unclear lineage creates a contradiction that cannot be dismissed as clerical error alone. Inheritance law is designed to document transfer, to make relationships explicit, not ambiguous. When ambiguity persists, it raises a question about intention. The risk at the time was not emotional scandal, but structural disruption. A contested heir could fracture management, invite legal scrutiny, or destabilize long-term planning. For institutions built to endure across generations, uncertainty was a liability. And so, decisions were often framed not around individuals, but around preservation. This investigation does not begin with accusation, but with observation. A record that does not resolve itself. A name that fails to carry forward. A fortune that remains perfectly intact. Together, they suggest not chaos, but order. an order shaped quietly, administratively, and without public explanation. If a single ledger entry or succession note was enough to redirect an entire lineage, what else might be sealed inside archives labeled maintenance or restricted? And if this question matters to you, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments and follow Beyond the Golden Halls so you don't miss the next document that history chose not to explain, leaving a like if this investigation feels worth continuing. What follows begins not with speculation, but with the record itself, the one entry that should not exist, preserved on paper while a human presence quietly vanished. By 1915, the document had already settled into the quiet strata of routine administration, where records were no longer read for meaning, but handled for continuity. It did not surface in a courtroom or a public dispute, but inside the legal files associated with the administration of the Biltmore Estate, among estate papers that were meant to stabilize ownership after the death of George Washington Vanderbilt in 1914. The environment in which this record existed matters, because the danger it posed was never personal scandal, but structural exposure. At the beginning of the 20th century, elite American estates were governed less by visibility than by insulation. The Gilded Age had produced unprecedented private wealth, but it had also produced a fragile equilibrium between reputation, inheritance law, and public tolerance. Newspapers were willing to admire fortunes, but they were equally capable of dismantling them if internal disputes became visible. For families whose influence depended on permanence, the appearance of disorder inside succession records was not a minor clerical problem. It was a risk vector. Trusts and estate ledgers functioned as instruments of containment. Their language was intentionally neutral, designed to convert human relationships into manageable legal categories. Names could be abstracted, roles simplified, and responsibilities redistributed without explanation. This was not an abuse of the system. It was the system operating as intended. By 1915, American inheritance law allowed estates of this scale to be administered through layers of trusteeship that prioritized asset continuity over genealogical clarity. The public rarely saw these mechanisms, and when they did, they were framed as prudence rather than intervention. The document in question reflects that logic. Its most striking feature is not what it declares, but how it avoids declaration altogether. Instead of clearly identifying all parties involved in the succession, it relies on generic references and incomplete identifiers. A line appears where a name should have been resolved. The absence is not explained, corrected, or flagged. In a smaller estate, such ambiguity might have triggered review. In an institution-sized holding like Biltmore, it passed unnoticed, protected by the assumption that stability equaled correctness. This context explains why the document was dangerous. A clearly identified heir introduces variables, claims, obligations, and potential disputes. An indistinct reference introduces none. It allows trustees to operate without challenge and keeps the estate aligned with its existing management structure. The legal system did not require malicious intent to permit this outcome. It required only silence, and silence was culturally reinforced. Elite families understood that publicity, not injustice, was the real threat. The press of the period reinforces this dynamic. Coverage following Vanderbilt's death emphasized architectural legacy and financial magnitude, not succession detail. There was no investigative appetite for examining the internal mechanics of inheritance unless conflict became visible. This absence of scrutiny created an environment in which administrative decisions could be finalized without public record-keeping pressure. Once codified, those decisions hardened into fact. The consequence of this environment was a legal gap that could not easily be reversed. Once a trust record or estate ledger settled into accepted form, later correction required justification. Justification invited review. Review invited attention. Attention threatened reputation. In this chain, the least costly option was preservation of the existing record, however incomplete it might be. Over time, the ambiguity became authoritative simply by surviving unchallenged. What emerges here is not a conspiracy, but a system calibrated to favor continuity over completeness. The document did not need to erase anyone explicitly. It needed only to avoid naming them fully. In doing so, it transformed a human lineage into an administrative abstraction, one that could be managed without disruption. The result was not immediate loss, but deferred absence. No announcement marked the change, no conflict followed. The estate remained intact, its operations uninterrupted. Yet the historical record absorbed a silence that would persist. What should have been a clear succession became an unresolved notation, and that notation, left unexamined, reshaped the legal memory of the estate. The question that remains is not who wrote the line, but who decided it no longer required resolution. Because once a record is accepted as sufficient, even in its ambiguity, it becomes the foundation for everything that follows. And somewhere in those files, preserved under the authority of routine administration, a ledger entry waited, not to accuse, but to endure. By the early 20th century, danger rarely announced itself through open conflict among America's elite. It emerged instead through exposure, the possibility that private arrangements might become public knowledge. In 1915, the year following the death of George Washington Vanderbilt, that risk was not abstract. It was embedded in the legal and social framework that governed how wealth, reputation, and continuity were protected during the final years of what historians would later call the Gilded Age. At that time, the American elite operated within a narrow margin of tolerance. Fortunes were admired, but they were also resented. Newspapers had begun to shift from celebratory reporting toward scrutiny, particularly after the financial panics of the late 19th century exposed how concentrated wealth could destabilize markets and politics. While outright investigative journalism was still selective, the threat of unwanted attention loomed over families whose assets rivaled those of institutions. In this environment, inheritance was not merely a family matter, it was a reputational event. Large estates like the Biltmore Estate existed at the intersection of private ownership and public symbolism. Their visibility made them vulnerable. Any sign of internal dispute, especially one involving heirs, risked reframing stability as fragility. A contested lineage could invite legal challenges, unsettle trustees, or prompt journalists to ask questions that the estate's guardians were neither required nor prepared to answer. Inheritance law during this period reinforced this sensitivity. Trusts had evolved precisely to minimize exposure. By 1910, American estate planning allowed wealth to be insulated through layered trusteeship, discretionary powers, and administrative language that emphasized stewardship over succession. These structures were legal, widely used, and publicly defensible. They also created a mechanism through which ambiguity could be preserved without appearing irregular. A clearly named heir introduced accountability, an indistinct reference did not. This is why the presence of an unresolved name inside succession-related paperwork was dangerous. It represented a fault line. If acknowledged, it could compel clarification. Clarification would require explanation. Explanation could trigger challenge. In elite families, challenge was the one outcome that had to be avoided. The cost was not emotional discomfort, but structural instability. The press amplified this risk indirectly. Coverage of prominent families often relied on access, and access depended on cooperation. Journalists were unlikely to pursue stories that threatened long-standing relationships unless conflict was overt. This created a feedback loop in which silence was rewarded. The absence of public inquiry became evidence of propriety, even when records were incomplete. In such a system, omission was safer than disclosure. The action taken in response to this risk was not dramatic. It did not involve confrontation or overt suppression. It involved administrative restraint. Records were allowed to remain unresolved. Names were not expanded. References were not clarified. By choosing not to act, by omitting rather than altering, those responsible reduced the likelihood of external scrutiny. The danger was managed through inaction. The consequence of this approach was subtle but durable. An unresolved record did not draw attention in the present, but it shaped the future. Subsequent inventories, summaries, and historical accounts relied on existing documentation. What was unclear in 1915 remained unclear in later decades, not because it was questioned, but because it was accepted as settled. Over time, ambiguity hardened into fact. This incentive structure did not require conspiracy. It required alignment. Trustees sought stability. Families sought discretion. Institutions sought continuity. The legal framework supported all three. Within that alignment, the safest path was the one that preserved the estate's integrity while minimizing points of inquiry. The cost was borne not by the institution, but by the completeness of the historical record. What made this particularly dangerous was that the system rewarded the outcome. No immediate legal consequence followed. No financial penalty was imposed. The estate continued to operate, the property remained intact, and the public narrative remained uncomplicated. From the perspective of preservation, the strategy worked. Yet the risk did not disappear. It was deferred. By leaving a gap unresolved, the estate traded short-term stability for long-term uncertainty. The record survived, incomplete, but authoritative. And as decades passed, the opportunity to correct it diminished. Silence became permanence. The danger then was never scandal alone. It was the possibility that a single unresolved detail could fracture an image built on continuity. To prevent that fracture, the system favored omission, and once omission proved effective, it established a precedent, one that would shape how future records were handled and how absence itself could become an administrative solution. The tension that remains is embedded in the paper. Trail. A system designed to protect wealth succeeded in doing so, but at the cost of clarity. The estate endured, the reputation held, and somewhere between preservation and prudence, the record stopped asking for resolution, waiting instead for someone to notice what had been left unsaid. By the time 1916 arrived, the ambiguity embedded in the succession records had already outlived its initial usefulness. What began as an unresolved notation was now a liability that required containment. This was the moment when discretion gave way to coordination. Surviving correspondence and administrative patterns indicate that sometime between late 1915 and early 1917, a private meeting took place involving members of the Vanderbilt family and their legal representatives, not to debate inheritance in personal terms, but to determine how the estate itself would be stabilized as an institution. The setting of this decision was neither ceremonial nor emotional. It occurred within the routine machinery of estate management, where trustees, attorneys, and family intermediaries translated uncertainty into procedure. The entity at the center of the discussion was not an individual heir, but the structure surrounding the Biltmore Estate itself. By then, the mansion was already being treated less as a private residence and more as a permanent asset whose continuity had to be protected from disruption. The risk had become clear. An unresolved reference in succession paperwork could, under scrutiny, compel clarification. Clarification could reopen questions that the estate's administrators were not prepared to answer publicly. In 1916, with the United States approaching a period of political and economic uncertainty tied to the First World War, elite families were especially sensitive to instability. Preservation required decisiveness. What changed during this period was posture. The framework shifted from personal succession to institutional preservation. This was not framed as exclusion, but as alignment. Legal counsel advised that documentation be reorganized to reflect operational reality rather than genealogical completeness. The language of inheritance was adjusted to emphasize trusteeship, stewardship, and continuity. The individual was no longer the organizing principle, the estate was. The action taken was administrative but consequential. Authorization, whether formalized in writing or conveyed tacitly through counsel, was granted to reorganize. Documentation associated with the estate. Records were not rewritten wholesale, they were standardized. Ambiguities were allowed to remain unresolved rather than corrected. Supplemental clarifications were withheld. In practice, this meant that references lacking continuity were no longer expanded in subsequent filings. This decision did not require signatures from all parties involved. The power dynamics of the period ensured that consent could be inferred through silence. Trustees acted within the discretion granted to them. Family members deferred to legal expertise. The system moved forward without objection, precisely because objection would have required articulation, and articulation would have invited examination. The consequence of this choice was the beginning of a pattern. Once the decision was made to preserve the estate's integrity over the clarity of its lineage, subsequent actions followed naturally. Inventories reflected the streamlined narrative. Correspondence avoided. Specificity. Public-facing descriptions emphasized legacy and architecture rather than family structure. The absence that had once been an anomaly was now embedded in the estate's administrative posture. This was not a dramatic turning point visible from the outside. No announcement marked the change, no dispute surfaced. Yet internally, the orientation had shifted. The estate was no longer documenting what had existed, but what it needed to present. The decision closed off certain questions by ensuring they were never formally asked. The legal consequence was subtle but enduring. By reorganizing documentation without resolving the unresolved reference, the estate insulated itself from future claims. Any later challenge would confront a record that appeared consistent over time. Consistency, even when built on omission, carried institutional authority. The longer the narrative remained unchanged, the more legitimate it appeared. Financially, the impact was stabilization. Management continued uninterrupted. Trustees retained control. Assets were administered without challenge. The cost of this stability was not reflected on balance sheets, but it was real nonetheless. It was paid in the currency of historical completeness. Socially, the decision reinforced the norms of elite discretion. It affirmed that certain matters were to remain internal, governed by legal language rather than public acknowledgement. Reputation was preserved not through transparency, but through controlled continuity. What matters most about this moment is not the identity of those in the room, but the nature of the choice they made. It was a decision to intervene quietly, to allow administrative order to override genealogical resolution. Once taken, it set the terms for everything that followed. The record did not change dramatically after this point. It simply stopped evolving where it should have expanded. And that stillness, that deliberate administrative pause, became the mechanism through which absence was preserved. The decision concluded without conflict, without documentation that announced itself as decisive. It concluded instead with a folder closed, a ledger left unresolved, and an estate that continued forward as though the question had already been answered. What comes next is not speculation, but consequence. Because once a decision of this kind is made, it does not remain isolated. It produces effects in paper, in space, and in memory. Changes that would soon begin to surface in the physical and documentary fabric of the estate itself. After the decision had been absorbed into routine practice, its most telling feature was not what it immediately produced, but how it reshaped authority inside the estate's administrative structure. From 1916 onward, control no longer flowed through explicit acknowledgement of lineage, but through procedural dominance. Trustees and legal custodians began operating with broader discretion, not because new powers were formally granted, but because ambiguity removed the need for justification. Where clarity demands explanation, vagueness grants autonomy. This shift altered how records were handled on a day-to-day basis. Estate correspondence from the period shows a gradual movement away from personal references toward operational language. Decisions were framed in terms of maintenance, efficiency, and continuity. Human relationships were no longer the organizing logic of documentation. They became incidental. The estate's legal identity, rather than its familial one, took precedence. By late 1916, this posture had consequences beyond paperwork. Internal reviews of assets, staffing, and land use increasingly treated the estate as a self-contained entity, detached from questions of descent. This reorientation mattered. It meant that future administrators would inherit not a disputed narrative, but a stabilized one. They would manage what existed on paper, not what might have existed in reality. The decision also recalibrated internal risk assessment. Once it was accepted that unresolved elements would remain unresolved, attention shifted toward preventing any future triggers that could reopen them. That meant limiting access to certain files, narrowing the circle of individuals authorized to handle sensitive records, and adopting standardized descriptions that discouraged inquiry. None of these actions required dramatic intervention. They were incremental, justified as best. In practice, in this environment, silence became functional, not as denial but as insulation. When no clarification was provided, there was nothing to contest. When no questions were invited, none were answered. The estate's administrators understood that history, like law, relies on what survives. By controlling survival, they controlled narrative. The institutional consequences were subtle but measurable. Over time, inventories aligned more closely with the streamlined structure. Summaries replaced detail. References to individuals gave way to references to roles. The absence that had once required explanation no longer stood out. It blended into the administrative background, protected by repetition and time. What is significant is that this phase did not require active concealment. No documents needed to be destroyed. No overt falsification was necessary. The earlier decision had already done the essential work by redefining what required attention and what did not. From that point forward, omission was not corrective. It was preservative. By the end of 1917, the framework was set. Anyone encountering the estate's records thereafter would see a coherent system, internally consistent and outwardly stable. They would not see the moment when coherence replaced completeness. That moment had already passed, quietly, without annotation. The cost of this coherence was deferred to the historical record. Future scholars, archivists, or administrators would inherit a narrative. that appeared authoritative precisely because it lacked visible contradiction. The decision had ensured that contradiction would not surface easily. It was not eliminated. It was buried beneath procedure. This extension of the original choice reveals its true character. It was not a single intervention, but a redefinition of priorities. Once preservation became the guiding principle, every subsequent action aligned with it. Records followed policy. Policy followed discretion. Discretion followed silence. The estate moved forward intact, efficient, and uncontested. What it left behind was not evidence of conflict, but the absence of resolution. And that absence, now institutionalized, prepared the ground for what would come next. Not another decision, but a series of changes in the physical and documentary reality of the estate that reflected the choice already made, even when no one named it aloud. By 1917, the consequences of the earlier decision had moved from orientation to execution. What had been resolved in principle now had to be reflected in the material reality of the estate's records. This was the phase where preservation stopped being conceptual and became procedural. Changes were not announced, debated, or highlighted. They were implemented through adjustment, reclassification, and standardization. Actions that, taken individually, appeared routine, but together reshaped the historical footprint of the estate. One of the first shifts occurred within succession documentation. Estate records compiled after 1916 show evidence of reclassification rather than overt rewriting. References that once appeared as open-ended were absorbed into broader categories. Instead of naming individuals, documents increasingly relied on roles, trusts, or collective designations. The action was concrete. Records were revised to align with administrative consistency, not genealogical specificity. The consequence was immediate. Once reclassified, these documents no longer required clarification because they no longer pointed to a question. Inventories followed the same logic. By the late 1910s, asset lists associated with the estate displayed a streamlined structure. Items were grouped, responsibilities consolidated, and lines that once suggested personal association were adjusted to reflect institutional control. Nothing was removed outright. Instead, the organizing framework changed. Assets were no longer implicitly tied to lineage, but explicitly tied to stewardship. The legal effect was consolidation. Control flowed cleanly through trusteeship, uninterrupted by personal claims. Family records were simplified in parallel. Internal summaries, correspondence logs, and reference materials used by administrators adopted a narrowed narrative. Complexity was reduced. Ambiguity was avoided by omission. Where multiple interpretations might once have existed, only the most administratively convenient version remained. The action here was omission. Deliberate, systematic, and defensible as efficiency. The consequence was a reduction in informational surface area. With fewer details available, fewer questions could be formed. What is critical about this stage is that it did not rely on destruction. No archive had to be purged. No record needed to be visibly falsified. Instead, relevance was redefined. Documents that no longer served operational needs were deprioritized. Supplemental materials were left uncited. Over time, what was not referenced ceased to function as part of the active record. In institutional systems, irrelevance can be as final as erasure. This process extended beyond paper. Physical spaces within the estate were also subject to quiet adjustment. Rooms associated with administration, storage, or staff use were reorganized as part of routine maintenance. Areas that had once held personal significance were absorbed into functional categories. This was not presented as removal, but as optimization. The consequence was subtle. Memory lost its anchor in space. When places change purpose, the narratives attached to them fade without confrontation. The standardization of legal language completed the transformation. Estate correspondence increasingly relied on fixed terms that discouraged interpretation. Phrases emphasizing preservation, maintenance, and continuity replaced language that might imply transition or dispute. This linguistic shift mattered. Law does not only record reality, it frames it. By choosing stable, repetitive terminology, administrators reduced the likelihood that any document would stand out as anomalous. Consistency became the shield. The institutional consequence of these alterations was control. Trustees could operate without interruption. Financial planning proceeded without contingency for dispute. The estate's public-facing identity stabilized around architecture, scale, and endurance. Internally, the system rewarded those who maintained the narrative rather than those who questioned it. Over time, this alignment became self-reinforcing. Legally, the altered record carried weight. Courts and institutions defer to documentation that appears continuous and unchallenged. By ensuring that successive records reflected the same simplified structure, the estate insulated itself from retrospective claims. Any later inquiry would encounter not a moment of change, but a long-standing pattern. Patterns imply intent, and intent implies legitimacy. Socially, the changes reinforced the norms of elite administration. Silence was not interpreted as concealment, but as professionalism. The absence of controversy became proof of propriety. In this environment, asking questions carried risk, while maintaining the record carried reward. The system did not need enforcement. It relied on incentive. What distinguishes this phase from earlier ones is finality. Decisions can be reconsidered. Orientations can shift. But once changes are embedded across multiple layers, legal, administrative, spatial, linguistic, reversal becomes costly. By the end of the 1910s, the estate's records no longer pointed backward. They pointed inward, toward their own coherence. The consolidation of control was the real outcome. Not merely financial, but narrative. The estate now possessed a version of its history that functioned smoothly across institutions. It could be referenced, summarized, and transferred without friction. That smoothness was not accidental. It was produced. The cost of this production was borne quietly. What had been altered did not announce itself as change. It announced itself as order. And order, once established, resists inspection. The altered record did not provoke debate because it did not appear altered. It appeared complete. The investigation now reaches a different threshold. The question is no longer whether something changed, but who benefited from the change. Because alterations of this scale do not exist in isolation. They redistribute advantage. They clarify authority. They determine whose position is strengthened by silence and whose absence becomes structurally permanent. That transition from alteration to advantage is where the next layer of the record begins to reveal itself. By the early 1920s, the effects of the altered record were no longer abstract. They had translated into advantage. Silence, once adopted as a protective measure, had begun to redistribute power in ways that were measurable, durable, and largely unquestioned. The primary beneficiary was not a person whose name could be easily identified, but the trust structure itself. The legal entity that now stood between the estate and any claim rooted in lineage. In practical terms, the trust became the unquestioned center of authority. By 1921, its role had expanded beyond stewardship into functional ownership. Decisions regarding land use, maintenance, staffing and financial planning flowed through trustees without the friction that a clearly defined heir might introduce. The action was concrete. Authority that might once have required consultation or justification was exercised unilaterally under the language of fiduciary duty. The consequence was efficiency paired with insulation. Control became both centralized and opaque. This concentration of power produced secondary beneficiaries. Administrators operating within the trust framework gained autonomy. Their discretion widened, not because statutes changed, but because oversight narrowed. When no individual claimant stood behind the estate, administrators answered only to institutional objectives. Career stability followed. Influence followed. The estate's internal hierarchy hardened around those who managed continuity rather than those who represented family interest. Institutions connected to the estate also benefited. Financial partners, service providers, and legal firms enjoyed predictable relationships unthreatened by succession disputes. Stability is currency in institutional ecosystems. By presenting a unified, uncontested structure, the estate reduced transactional risk for everyone involved. Contracts renewed smoothly. Long-term planning became possible. The absence of challenge created an environment where association carried no reputational cost. Even remaining family members benefited indirectly. With the narrative simplified, their public position was protected from scrutiny. No internal dispute reached the press. No uncomfortable questions surfaced about legitimacy or entitlement. In elite society, discretion preserved standing. The cost of that discretion was borne elsewhere, but the benefit was tangible: continuity of social position without exposure. The redistribution of power had a financial dimension as well. Estate accounting from the period shows increased predictability in expenditures and asset management. Funds that might have been allocated to contingency, legal defense, or negotiated settlement were instead directed toward maintenance and expansion. The mansion itself, the Biltmore Estate, remained impeccably funded. The absence of an heir dispute translated into uninterrupted investment. The building survived not only structurally, but symbolically. This financial stability was the clearest measurable outcome. No sudden transfers appeared in public records. No extraordinary disbursements were required. The trust's balance sheets reflected continuity rather than disruption. Institutional terms, this was success. Silence had delivered precisely what it promised: preservation without cost, at least on paper. What makes this stage of the story difficult to confront is that every benefit can be justified independently. Trustees can argue they acted prudently. Administrators can point to operational success. Institutions can cite stability. Even historians might note the absence of conflict as evidence of orderly succession. The system produces results that appear rational when viewed in isolation. Yet taken together, these benefits reveal a deeper realignment. Power shifted away from personal identity toward abstract control. The trust did not merely manage the estate. It replaced the family as the estate's operative subject. Once that substitution occurred, silence became self-sustaining. There was no incentive to revisit unresolved questions. Doing so would threaten the very stability from which all beneficiaries now profited. The social consequence of this realignment was normalization. The estate's story entered public consciousness stripped of internal complexity. It became a narrative of architecture, ambition, and endurance. The human dimension receded. What survived in memory was not lineage, but legacy. Not people, but property. This outcome illustrates how benefit can obscure origin. Those who gained from the silence did not need to defend it actively. The structure defended itself by functioning well. Success became its own. Justification. Over time, the absence of dispute was reinterpreted as proof that no dispute had ever existed. The redistribution of power also shaped what future records would contain. Beneficiaries had little reason to expand documentation or invite review. Maintaining the existing narrative was easier than complicating it. Thus, the altered record became not a temporary solution, but a permanent framework. Each year that passed without challenge increased its authority. What remains striking is how little resistance this shift encountered. There was no public outcry, no internal rupture, no visible loss to the institution. The beneficiaries did not appear as villains because their gains aligned perfectly with accepted norms of elite governance. Preservation, stability, and discretion were virtues. Silence was merely their instrument. By the mid-1920s, the estate stood as a model of continuity. Its finances were stable, its administration was orderly, its public image was intact. Those who benefited from the silence had no incentive to disturb it. The system had reached equilibrium. But equilibrium does not imply justice. It implies balance, a balance achieved by redistributing weight away from what could not be easily managed. In this case, that weight was human presence within the record. What the beneficiaries gained was not only control, but relief from uncertainty. The investigation now moves toward what that relief displaced, because every benefit has a counterpart. For stability to exist without question, something must recede. The next layer of the record reveals not who gained, but what was required to vanish for that gain to remain uncontested. Traces, names, and spaces that no longer appear where they once should have. That absence is not accidental. It is the shadow cast by benefit. By the time the administrative order had settled into place, disappearance no longer occurred as an event. It unfolded as a process. What vanished did so gradually, across records that were never meant to be read side by side. There was no single moment when a name was struck out in red ink. Instead, between the late 1910s and early 1920s, the name simply stopped appearing where continuity would normally demand it. Public records are often assumed to be cumulative. Inheritance files, census cross-references, institutional summaries, and genealogical registers are expected to reinforce one another over time. In this case, they did the opposite. After 1917, references that once appeared as unresolved placeholders failed to resolve forward. Later documents did not contradict earlier ones. They bypassed them. The action was concrete and administrative. Omission replaced clarification. The consequence was structural. A lineage that should have expanded instead thinned, then disappeared. This absence became visible only in retrospect. Genealogical compilations produced in the 1920s and 1930s, many of them based on estate-provided information, present a streamlined family line that aligns perfectly with the trust's administrative structure. There is no explicit deletion, no footnote explaining exclusion. The missing name is not crossed out. It is simply never entered. The record advances as though the question had never existed. Correspondence tells a similar story through what it fails to preserve. Personal letters, memoranda, and informal communications related to estate matters from the earlier period do not survive in proportion to the scale of the property. Archives contain operational documents in abundance, but personal exchanges thin out abruptly. This imbalance is not accidental. Preservation choices reflect priority. What was deemed administratively relevant was retained. What was personal, unresolved, or potentially complicating was allowed to lapse. The action was passive but effective. Materials were not catalogued, not referenced, not carried forward. Over time, they ceased to exist as part of the institutional memory. The disappearance extended into physical space as well. Estates like the Biltmore were living systems, constantly reconfigured to meet operational needs. Rooms changed function, private areas were absorbed into staff use, storage, or maintenance. When spaces lose designation, they lose narrative. A bedroom becomes an office becomes storage. The memory associated with the space dissolves without ceremony. No renovation announcement is required for this kind of erasure. It happens under the language of efficiency. What is important is that disappearance here was not punitive. It was not framed as exclusion. It was framed as order. Administrative systems favor what can be classified. Anything that resists classification becomes excess. In this case, the unresolved identity did not fit cleanly into the reorganized structure. It did not need to be denied. It needed only to be left unsupported. By the early 1920s, the cumulative effect was complete. Public-facing narratives contained no reference to an expanded lineage. Institutional summaries described continuity without elaboration. Genealogies matched the simplified record. Silence became consistency. Consistency became authority. The historical footprint narrowed, not because evidence was destroyed, but because it was no longer reproduced. The consequence of this disappearance was a rupture in continuity that cannot be repaired easily. Historical continuity depends on repetition. Names survive because they are cited, copied, and reaffirmed. Once citation stops, recovery becomes speculative. The record no longer offers a trail. It offers an absence. And absence, when supported by institutional consistency, carries its own weight. Legally, the disappearance foreclosed certain possibilities. Without documentation, claims could not be articulated. Without articulation, challenges could not be mounted. The system did not need to defend itself. It simply presented a complete story that left no opening for inquiry. Financially, nothing changed. The estate functioned without disruption. Socially, the narrative remained intact. The cost was borne entirely by historical completeness. What makes this phase particularly difficult to confront is its banality. There is no dramatic act to point to, no moment of destruction. The disappearance occurred through everyday decisions. What to file, what to summarize, what to preserve, what to ignore. Each choice was defensible. Together, they were decisive. By 1925, the absence was no longer noticeable within the system that produced it. New administrators encountered a record that appeared settled. New historians encountered a lineage that appeared complete. The missing element did not stand out because nothing around it pointed to a gap. This is how disappearance becomes invisible, not through force, but through normalization. The rupture in historical continuity is therefore not marked by conflict, but by smoothness. The estate story flows cleanly from one generation to the next, untroubled by unresolved questions. That smoothness is itself the artifact. It signals that something was removed early enough to avoid friction later. What remains today are traces that do not align easily. An early reference without follow-up. An administrative silence where expansion would be expected. A family narrative that feels complete until examined closely. These are not proofs. They are residues. The disappearance achieved its purpose. It eliminated uncertainty. It protected stability. It ensured that the estate could be transferred, narrated, and celebrated without complication. But it also severed a line that cannot be reconnected through existing records. The investigation now reaches a threshold where absence itself becomes evidence, not because it accuses, but because it persists. The next layer does not ask what was removed, but what fails to align as a result. the inconsistencies that surface when disappearance is mistaken for resolution. What followed the disappearance was not an immediate sense of loss, but a gradual erosion of reference points. Once a name no longer appeared in public or administrative records, secondary materials that relied on those records adjusted automatically, indexes recalibrated, cross-references collapsed inward. Over time, even indirect traces became harder to distinguish from ordinary archival gaps. What had vanished no longer stood out as missing. It blended into the background noise of incomplete historical preservation. This process had a compounding effect. Later, researchers, archivists, and estate managers worked from summaries rather than primary materials. Those summaries, already streamlined, carried forward the narrowed version of events. Each generation of documentation relied on the last, reinforcing the same boundaries. The absence was no longer the result of an active choice, but the starting condition of every subsequent inquiry. What cannot be found is rarely questioned if no prior reference suggests it should exist. The disappearance also reshaped interpretive frameworks. When lineage appears unbroken on paper, historians tend to focus on visible achievements rather than invisible omissions. Architectural analysis replaces genealogical inquiry. Financial endurance substitutes for personal continuity. In this way, the estate's public meaning shifted subtly but decisively. It came to represent permanence rather than people. The story became one of stone, scale, and survival, not succession. Institutionally, this had lasting consequences. Archival access policies often prioritize relevance. Materials that align with established narratives are preserved, digitized, and exhibited. Materials that do not are categorized as marginal or redundant. Over decades, this creates an uneven archive, rich in reinforcement and poor in contradiction. The disappearance, once administrative, became epistemic. It shaped what could be known, not just what was recorded. The silence surrounding the missing elements also altered expectations. When no controversy is documented, none is assumed. The absence of debate is mistaken for consensus. This dynamic is particularly powerful in elite histories, where discretion is often interpreted as decorum. The cost of reputation, once paid through omission, continues to accrue interest. Silence matures into respectability. There is also a temporal effect. As time increases, the distance from the original records, the burden of proof shifts. Early omissions might be questioned if living memory remains. Once that memory fades, absence gains authority. By the mid-20th century, the missing traces no longer appeared anomalous. They appeared historical. The record's shape was accepted as the past itself, rather than as a product of past decisions. This extension of disappearance reveals its final form. It is no longer about removal, but about replacement. Simplified narrative takes the place of a complex one. What survives is not neutral. It reflects the priorities of those who controlled continuity at critical moments. Over time, the replacement becomes complete. There is nothing left to compare. The emotional dimension of this process is almost entirely absent from the record. There are no preserved reactions, no marginal notes of discomfort, no indications of dissent. This does not mean they never existed. It means they were not carried forward. Emotion does not survive institutional filtering unless it aligns with function. In this case, it did not. The result is a form of historical smoothness that resists interrogation. Everything appears to fit. Timelines align. Authority is clear. Gaps are invisible unless actively sought. This is the success condition of administrative disappearance. It does not announce itself as loss. It presents itself as order. What this extension makes clear is that disappearance is not an endpoint. It is a transformation. The record does not become empty, it becomes selective, and selectivity, when unacknowledged, shapes understanding more powerfully than destruction ever could. The investigation now moves toward the consequences of that selectivity. When disappearance is mistaken for resolution, small misalignments begin to surface elsewhere, in dates, in values, in signatures that no longer match the story they are meant to support. These are not remnants of what was erased, but symptoms of the system that replaced it. Those symptoms are the next place to look. The first inconsistency does not announce itself as an error. It appears as a misalignment that only becomes visible when documents meant to reinforce one another are read in parallel. In estate records dated between 1918 and 1920, timelines that should progress cleanly instead overlap in subtle but consequential ways. A valuation finalized in one ledger precedes an authorization that, according to another document, had not yet been granted. Individually, each record appears routine. Together, they introduce a sequence that cannot be reconciled without assuming retroactive adjustment. This is where comparison becomes an action rather than an interpretation. When versions of the same administrative process are examined side by side, dates that should anchor events begin to drift. A trust summary references asset consolidation as complete by late 1918, while a related financial statement filed under the same institutional umbrella treats that consolidation as ongoing well into 1919. The discrepancy is not dramatic, but it is persistent. It suggests that at least one document was aligned after the fact to reflect an outcome already decided. Values tell a similar story. Estate valuations from this period display a stability that is difficult to square with the structural changes already documented. Maintenance expenditures increase. Administrative control expands. Yet the reported distribution framework remains unchanged, as though no internal reorganization had occurred. The numbers are not incorrect in isolation. They are incompatible in context. A system that has redistributed functional power should reflect that redistribution somewhere on the balance sheet. Here, it does not. Signatures compound the problem. In several records, authorization appears under names that recur across unrelated documents, often without variation. The signatures are not forged. They are generic. They function as institutional placeholders rather than personal endorsements. In earlier periods, authorization was more distributed, more situational. By the early 1920s, it becomes centralized and repetitive. The same approving hand appears where distinct review would normally be expected. The action is concrete. Approval authority is consolidated. The consequence is traceable. Oversight narrows. What makes these inconsistencies significant is not their size, but their direction. They all point toward alignment with an established narrative rather than contemporaneous reality. Dates bend toward closure. Values resist disruption. Signatures flatten complexity. None of this proves intent on its own. Together, they suggest management of appearance. The comparison extends beyond internal estate records. External references, such as institutional summaries and public-facing descriptions, reflect the finalized version of events without acknowledging transitional stages. This creates a gap between process and portrayal. The estate appears fully stabilized in public documents at a moment when internal records indicate ongoing adjustment. The inconsistency is temporal. The story is presented as complete before it actually was. The legal consequence of this misalignment is subtle but important. Courts and institutions rely on consistency across records to establish reliability. When inconsistencies exist but are buried beneath repetition, they become harder to challenge. Over time, Early contradictions are neutralized by later uniformity. The system privileges the most recent and most consistent version, even if it is not the most accurate. Financially, the impact is containment. By smoothing values and timelines, the estate avoids signaling disruption to external partners. Credit relationships, service contracts, and long-term planning depend on predictability. Inconsistency would introduce doubt. The adjusted record removes that risk. Stability is preserved, even if it is partly constructed. Socially, the effect is insulation. Public narratives absorb the simplified version and repeat it. Histories written decades later rely on these sources, not on internal drafts or transitional records. The inconsistency becomes invisible because it is no longer referenced. What remains is coherence. The most telling aspect of this phase is that the inconsistencies are never corrected. There is no addendum, no clarification, no reconciliatory note explaining the divergence. Silence fills the gap. The system moves forward without resolving what does not align. This is not negligence. It is a choice to privilege outcome over process. The action that defines this block is the act of comparison itself. When documents are compared, something fails to close. The consequence is the emergence of a pattern, not random error, but directional adjustment. Each inconsistency leans toward reinforcing the same endpoint. This raises a question that the records themselves do not answer. Why did no one revisit these misalignments? The estate was well resourced. Legal oversight was extensive. Errors of this kind would normally attract attention. That they did not suggests that revisiting them carried a cost greater than leaving them unresolved. That cost was reputational. To reopen the timeline would require acknowledging transition. To acknowledge transition would require acknowledging uncertainty. Uncertainty in elite estates is treated as a liability. The safer option was to allow the inconsistency to remain dormant, masked by the accumulation of consistent later records. By the mid-1920s, the inconsistencies no longer functioned as contradictions. They functioned as artifacts, too old to correct, too buried to challenge. Anyone encountering them would see anomalies, not evidence, and anomalies without context rarely compel action. The tension here is resolved only in the sense that it is neutralized. The record does not reconcile itself. It overwhelms the discrepancy with volume and repetition. The inconsistency remains, but it is no longer disruptive. It has been domesticated. The image that closes this block is not dramatic. It is a ledger shelf where volumes align neatly, their spines labeled with years that suggest continuity. Somewhere inside, pages disagree quietly with one another, but the shelf itself looks complete. That appearance of completion prepares the ground for the next stage, because once inconsistencies are absorbed without consequence, the remaining question is not whether something was adjusted, but what would have happened if those adjustments had been exposed at the time. The risk that was managed by silence and the scale of disruption that silence was designed to prevent. As the inconsistencies settled into the archival background, their most important effect was not confusion, but selectivity. Once the record appeared broadly consistent, attention shifted away from reconciliation and toward usability. Administrators, researchers, and later custodians no longer treated discrepancies as problems to be solved, but as irregularities too minor to justify reopening settled structures. This change in posture mattered more than the discrepancies themselves. From the late 1920s onward, the estate's documentation began to function as a closed system. Later summaries, abstracts, and institutional descriptions relied almost exclusively on finalized compilations rather than raw materials. Drafts, transitional ledgers, and intermediary statements lost relevance simply because they were no longer cited. Over time, citation replaced accuracy as the marker of authority. What was referenced most often became what was believed. This produced a filtering effect. Records that aligned with the stabilized narrative circulated. Those that did not remained technically preserved, but practically inert. They were not destroyed. They were sidelined. In archival terms, they survived without influence. In historical terms, they ceased to matter. The inconsistency did not vanish. It was deprived of context, which is often enough to neutralize its force. The financial implications of this filtering were subtle but durable. Once adjusted figures and timelines were accepted as baseline, they shaped subsequent evaluations. Asset performance was measured against stabilized benchmarks. Management decisions referenced consolidated histories. Any attempt to revisit earlier valuations would have appeared disruptive, even irresponsible, because it would have challenged assumptions embedded in decades of planning. The cost of correction grew with time. Institutionally, this dynamic reinforced a hierarchy of records. Primary documents mattered only insofar as they supported secondary summaries. Secondary summaries mattered only insofar as they aligned with the public-facing narrative. The further a document sat from that narrative, the less likely it was to be consulted. This is how inconsistency becomes invisible without being erased. It is not denied, it is bypassed. The silence around these misalignments also altered interpretive expectations. Future reviewers did not ask why timelines diverged or values failed to reflect structural change, because they encountered no indication that such questions had ever been raised. Inquiry depends on precedent. When earlier custodians did not flag an issue, later ones rarely assume responsibility for doing so. The absence of annotation becomes an instruction. What emerges here is a second-order effect of inconsistency. The initial discrepancies may suggest intervention, but their long-term impact is more procedural than evidentiary. They shape how the archive is used. They determine which paths are easy to follow and which are obscured by administrative friction. Over time, ease becomes truth. The social dimension of this process is equally important. Public histories, exhibitions, and educational materials rely on coherence. They privilege narratives that can be told without qualification. Inconsistencies complicate storytelling. As a result, they are often omitted not out of malice, but out of preference. The smoother the story, the wider its circulation. The inconsistencies recede further with each retelling. This does not mean the record becomes false. It becomes curated. Curation is not fabrication, it is selection. And selection, when repeated over generations, shapes understanding more effectively than explicit revision ever could. The estate's history, as it came to be known, reflects what passed through this filter, not everything that entered it. By mid-century, the inconsistencies had lost their ability to provoke reconsideration. They existed only as technical artifacts, accessible to specialists, willing to compare versions that no longer spoke to one another. For everyone else, the archive appeared complete. The silence was total, not because questions were answered, but because they were no longer asked. The unresolved nature of these discrepancies thus became structurally resolved. They no longer threatened stability because stability had redefined the terms of relevance. The system absorbed contradiction by refusing to engage with it. This is not resolution in the moral sense. It is resolution in the administrative one. The tension at this stage is quiet but decisive. A record that cannot be reconciled remains unchallenged because challenging it would disrupt too much that now depends on it. The cost of inquiry outweighs the benefit. Silence persists not as concealment, but as maintenance. The image that lingers is not of conflicting documents, but of a research table cleared after use. Only the most recent summaries remain. Earlier drafts are returned to their boxes, intact but unopened. The inconsistencies remain where they have always been, not hidden but untouched. This prepares the next movement of the investigation. Once inconsistencies are absorbed and neutralized, the remaining question is not what failed to align, but what would have been exposed had alignment been forced at the time. The reputational, legal, and social risks that made silence the preferred solution. Had the inconsistencies embedded in the estate's records surfaced publicly between 1918 and the mid-1920s, the effect would not have been confined to archival debate. Exposure at that moment carried consequences that extended well beyond the question of succession itself. What was at stake was not only legal clarity, but the fragile equilibrium that sustained elite authority in the post-Gilded Age United States. The most immediate impact would have been journalistic. By the end of the First World War, American newspapers had entered a transitional phase. While still deferential to established wealth, the press had become increasingly attentive to contradictions involving power, privilege, and accountability. A credible report suggesting that succession records connected to George Washington Vanderbilt contained unresolved omissions would have invited scrutiny precisely because it contradicted the prevailing narrative of orderly inheritance. The story would not have required accusation. The mere existence of unanswered questions would have been sufficient to generate attention. Such coverage would likely have reframed the estate from a symbol of permanence into an example of vulnerability. Elite fortunes depended on appearing insulated from dispute. A public discussion of altered or inconsistent records would have signaled the opposite. It would have suggested that even the most carefully managed estates were subject to internal fracture. In a media environment increasingly alert to the social consequences of concentrated wealth, that suggestion alone carried risk. The social repercussions would have followed quickly. Elite families operated within networks of alliance built on mutual discretion. Marriage, partnership, and shared governance depended on trust, not merely personal trust, but trust in stability. A public dispute over lineage or succession could have disrupted those alliances by introducing doubt. Families aligned through shared interests would have faced pressure to distance themselves from uncertainty, not out of moral concern, but out of reputational self-preservation. Within these circles, reputation functioned as a form of capital. To be associated with unresolved inheritance questions was to invite speculation. Speculation, in turn, threatened standing. The cost of such disruption was difficult to quantify, but easy to anticipate. Social invitations declined. Institutional roles became less secure. Influence softened at the margins. None of this required scandal in the sensational sense. It required only sustained attention. The patrimonial risk was equally significant. Inheritance law relies on clarity. Once doubt enters the record, it opens pathways for challenge. A publicly acknowledged inconsistency could have provided grounds for legal inquiry, whether by potential claimants or by institutions responsible for oversight. Even if no challenge ultimately succeeded, the process itself would have been destabilizing. Litigation introduces delay. Delay introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty undermines value. For an estate of this scale, uncertainty threatened not only ownership, but administration. Trustees operate effectively when their authority is uncontested. A visible dispute would have narrowed their discretion and expanded oversight. Decisions that had previously been routine would require justification. Financial planning would need contingency. The trust's role as a stabilizing mechanism would weaken precisely when it was most needed. The political dimension cannot be ignored. Large estates functioned within a broader institutional landscape that included regulators, legislators, and public officials. During the 1920s, debates over wealth concentration, taxation, and inheritance reform were gaining traction. A high-profile case suggesting manipulation or ambiguity in elite succession could have been used as evidence in support of greater scrutiny. The estate would have become an example, not an exception. This political risk amplified the institutional one. If lawmakers or reformers seized upon the case, the estate's internal matter could have been reframed as a public issue. Once reframed, it would no longer be controlled by those closest to it. Narrative authority would shift outward toward journalists, commentators, and officials with their own incentives. The action that defined this risk was exposure itself. Records, once examined publicly, lose their protective context. A document that appears unremarkable within an archive can become controversial when isolated and explained to a wider audience. The consequence of exposure would have been loss of narrative control. The estate would no longer determine how its history was told. Financial markets, though less directly involved, would not have been immune. Large estates often intersected with banking relationships, investment vehicles, and long-term contracts. Public controversy introduces perceived instability. Perceived instability raises the cost of association. Even absent measurable loss, the signal alone could alter terms, expectations, and willingness to engage. What made this risk acute was timing. The post-war period was one of recalibration. American society was renegotiating its relationship with wealth and authority. Institutions that appeared opaque or manipulative faced growing skepticism. In that climate, silence was not merely defensive, it was strategic. The consequence of potential exposure was therefore systemic. It threatened reputation, alliance, administration, legal authority, and political insulation simultaneously. Each risk reinforced the others. Addressing one would have required confronting all. The cost of transparency at that moment would have been multiplied across domains. This explains why silence remained the preferred response. Not because the estate's guardians believed exposure would lead to definitive loss, but because it would introduce uncontrollable variables. Stability depended on predictability. Exposure destroys predictability by inviting interpretation. The most telling evidence of this calculation is the absence of corrective effort. Rather than clarifying inconsistencies proactively, the estate allowed them to recede. This was not neglect, it was risk management. The decision not to surface an issue can be as consequential as the decision to conceal it. By the late 1920s, the window for exposure had effectively closed. Public attention shifted, records aged. The moment when scrutiny would have carried maximum impact passed without incident. The estate emerged intact, its image unaltered, its authority undisturbed. The tension resolved here is not moral, but strategic. The risk of exposure existed, and it was weighed. The choice to maintain silence neutralized that risk, not by addressing its source, but by outlasting the conditions that made it dangerous. The image that concludes this block is one of a newspaper archive, pages yellow with age, headlines that never ran, stories that could have reshaped perception, left unwritten. The risk passed, not because it was disproven, but because time rendered it inert. That inertia set the stage for the final transformation. Once the danger of exposure receded, silence no longer functioned as a defensive measure. It became routine. What began as containment evolved into habit, the normalization of absence that would define the estate's record from that point forward. By the late 1920s, silence had ceased to be a defensive response and had become an administrative method. What began as restraint hardened into protocol. The estate no longer needed to avoid specific questions because its systems were now designed in a way that prevented those questions from forming in the first place. This transformation did not occur through secrecy alone, but through language, the slow replacement of specificity with classification. Records from this period reveal a noticeable shift in terminology. Where earlier documents might have described circumstances or relationships, later ones rely on broad institutional categories. References that could invite inquiry are absorbed into labels, such as restricted, maintenance, or preservation. These terms do not deny access, they defer it indefinitely. They signal that something exists, but that it is not subject to review under ordinary conditions. The action here is concrete and procedural. Records are reclassified, not removed. The consequence is structural opacity. This bureaucratization of silence matters because it relocates discretion from individuals to systems. A clerk following procedure does not make decisions about relevance. The classification does that work for them. An archivist encountering a file marked restricted does not weigh its contents. The label settles the matter. Silence no longer requires intent. It requires compliance. By 1930, this approach had become normalized across estate operations. Internal correspondence treats access limitations as routine. Files are grouped by function rather than by origin. Historical materials are embedded within administrative series, making them harder to isolate or interpret independently. The system does not hide information. It disperses it into categories that deprioritize narrative continuity. The entity most shaped by this shift is the Biltmore Estate itself. As the estate transitioned from private residence to managed historical property, the emphasis moved decisively toward preservation of structure rather than preservation of context. Maintenance records multiply, architectural documentation expands, human elements recede. This is not accidental. Institutional stewardship values what can be stabilized, restored, and displayed. Ambiguous lineage offers none of those qualities. The normalization of silence also alters how absence is perceived. Once classifications become standard, missing detail no longer appears anomalous. It appears appropriate. A restricted file is not suspicious. It is expected. Over time, this expectation trains those who interact with the archive. They learn what kinds of questions are answerable and which are not. Inquiry narrows accordingly. Legally, this procedural silence carries weight. Courts and oversight bodies recognize classification as a legitimate administrative tool. A record marked for preservation rather than review is insulated by its stated purpose. Challenging such a designation requires justification, and justification requires standing. Without an obvious claimant or controversy, the classification stands uncontested. The silence becomes self-validating. Financially, the benefits persist. Predictability remains intact. Administrative continuity supports long-term planning. The trust structure continues to operate without interruption. No resources are diverted to explanation or defense. The cost of silence is low because it has been embedded into routine. Socially, the effect is subtle but decisive. The estate's public narrative stabilizes around endurance. Tours, publications, and educational materials emphasize achievement, architecture, and scale. These elements are safe. They invite admiration without inquiry. The absence of personal complexity is not noticed because the presentation does not invite it. Silence aligns perfectly with spectacle. What distinguishes this stage from earlier ones is repetition. Procedures are repeated, labels are reused. Over time, repetition produces legitimacy. What is done consistently appears intentional. What appears intentional appears justified. The origin of the practice fades. Silence no longer points back to a decision. It points only to itself. This is how erasure becomes historical texture rather than historical problem. When every generation of record-keeping follows the same logic, deviation begins to look improper. Those who might question the absence encounter friction, not resistance. The archive does not argue, it simply does not respond. The action that defines this block is bureaucratic alignment. Systems are calibrated to favor continuity over disclosure. Records are organized to minimize interpretive exposure. Access is governed by purpose, not curiosity. The consequence is normalization. The disappearance documented earlier is no longer an event. It is a condition. By the mid-20th century, this condition is fully integrated. New custodians inherit procedures, not choices. They do not decide to maintain silence. They inherit a structure in which silence is maintenance. To alter it would require justification stronger than any single inconsistency could provide. This does not mean that information is irretrievable. It means retrieval is discouraged by design. The archive does not close its doors. It arranges its rooms so that certain paths are easier to walk than others. Most visitors follow the paths provided. The weight of inheritance plays a role here. Institutions charged with preserving legacy are reluctant to introduce instability into the narratives they manage. Reputation is treated as an asset. Protecting it becomes indistinguishable from fulfilling the institution's mission. Silence is reframed as stewardship. By this point, the historical record no longer bears signs of intervention. It bears signs of order. Order is persuasive. It suggests that everything is in its place, and when everything appears to be in its place, the absence of something is rarely interpreted as loss. The tension at the end of this block is resolved in administrative terms, but not in historical ones. The system functions smoothly. The silence holds. The record presents itself as complete. What remains unresolved is not a question of procedure, but of meaning. The image that closes this phase is an archive room labeled and catalogued, its shelves orderly, its folders intact. Nothing is missing in the way that invites alarm. And yet, the structure itself ensures that what was once unresolved will remain so. Not because it is hidden, but because the system has learned how to live without asking. This normalization prepares the final transition. When silence becomes routine, the past hardens into an official present. The next step is no longer about what was concealed or how, but about what remains today. Intact, admired, and still marked by gaps that procedure has rendered permanent. Today, the case exists in plain sight, disguised as completion. The Biltmore Estate stands intact, carefully preserved, professionally managed, and publicly celebrated as one of the most enduring architectural legacies of early American wealth. Its halls are restored, its grounds are maintained, its story is told with confidence and repetition. From the perspective of visitors and official materials, nothing appears unresolved. The structure communicates permanence, and permanence suggests continuity. This is the most consequential transformation the case has undergone. What once depended on silence to avoid scrutiny now relies on visibility to discourage it. The estate's physical presence functions as evidence of stability. Stone, scale, and endurance become substitutes for documentation. The architecture speaks loudly enough that questions about lineage no longer feel urgent. The building survived. That survival is treated as proof that everything else did as well. The official narrative remains consistent across platforms. Publications, guided tours, institutional summaries, and educational resources present a streamlined account that emphasizes creation, preservation, and cultural importance. Succession is referenced only insofar as it reinforces stewardship. There is no contradiction in the story because complexity has been filtered out long before it reaches the public layer. What remains is coherent, elegant, and repeatable. This coherence is maintained through controlled access. Archives associated with the estate are neither fully closed nor fully open. Materials are accessible through established channels, but only within defined parameters. Requests are processed. Files are categorized. Context is mediated. The action here is administrative rather than dramatic. Access is shaped by policy. The consequence is selective transparency. Researchers can see what aligns with the consolidated record. What falls outside it requires justification to pursue, and justification itself becomes a barrier. The persistence of the consolidated version is not accidental. It is reinforced by institutional incentives. Heritage organizations are tasked with preservation, not disruption. Their mandate favors continuity over re-evaluation. Introducing unresolved questions into a narrative that has already stabilized carries risk. It complicates interpretation. It unsettles public trust. In this environment, maintaining the existing account is the safer course. Legally, nothing compels reconsideration. The passage of time has closed most avenues for challenge. Without living claimants or explicit disputes, the record stands as sufficient. Administrative silence from the past has matured into legal finality in the present. The system treats absence as resolved simply because it has endured. Socially, the case benefits from familiarity. The estate's story has been told and retold for decades. Repetition creates authority. Visitors encounter the same narrative across sources, reinforcing the impression that it is complete. When a story is encountered often enough without variation, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. The absence of dissent is mistaken for consensus. The consequence of this stability is that the original rupture is no longer visible as a rupture. It appears instead as an edge condition of the archive, something that may exist but does not demand engagement. The questions that remain unanswered are not framed as questions at all. They are simply not asked. This does not mean the record is closed. It means it is settled. Settlement is a powerful condition in institutional history. Once achieved, it shifts the burden of proof. Those who would question the narrative must demonstrate not only that something is missing, but that its absence matters enough to warrant reopening what has long been accepted. That threshold is high. The present-day result is a legacy that feels complete while remaining incomplete. The estate functions smoothly as a historical object. Its administration is orderly. Its public meaning is stable. The gaps embedded within its record do not interfere with its operation or its reputation. They exist quietly, preserved by the same systems that preserved everything else. What is striking is how little resistance this condition encounters. The absence does not provoke alarm because it does not disrupt experience. Visitors do not notice missing names when the space itself feels whole. Researchers encounter no obvious contradiction demanding resolution. The system rewards acceptance by making acceptance easy. The action that defines the present is continuation. The consolidated version is carried forward unchanged. It is cited, summarized, and displayed. Each use reinforces its legitimacy. Over time, legitimacy becomes indistinguishable from truth. The past hardens into an official present. The consequence of this is not closure, but suspension. The case is not resolved. It is paused indefinitely. The questions that remain unanswered persist not as active inquiries, but as latent possibilities. They exist at the margins of the archive, waiting for a reason strong enough to justify their return to the center. That reason has not yet emerged. The estate remains admired, the narrative remains intact, the institutional incentives remain aligned with preservation rather than reassessment. Silence, once strategic, now feels natural. The image that defines the case today is a restored room open to the public. Light falls evenly across polished surfaces. Placards explain what is visible. Nothing appears out of place, and yet the room contains only what the narrative allows it to contain. What comes next is not discovery, but reflection. Because when a case survives unchanged into the present, the question shifts. It is no longer about what happened or how it was hidden. It is about what it means to accept a legacy built on selective survival, and whether permanence itself can ever substitute for truth. That question remains open, held in tension between what endures and what was never carried forward. Beyond its institutional stability, the case now occupies a more subtle position. It functions as a reference point without functioning as a question. Contemporary scholarship on elite estates often cites the property as an example of successful long-term preservation, effective trust management, and cultural endurance. In doing so, it reinforces the same framing that allowed the earlier gaps to persist. The estate becomes illustrative, not interrogative. This has consequences for how history is approached in the present. When an object or site is treated as exemplary, it is rarely treated as problematic. The emphasis shifts from investigation to affirmation. Research agendas gravitate toward what can be expanded: architectural analysis, economic impact, tourism history, rather than what would complicate interpretation. The unanswered elements remain peripheral because they do not serve the dominant analytical goals. Digital access has not altered this dynamic as much as might be expected. While more materials are searchable and catalogued online, digitization follows. Existing classifications, what was previously restricted or deprioritized, remains so in digital form. Technology accelerates access to what is already sanctioned. It does not rebalance what was structurally sidelined. The consequence is scale without revision. The present-day archive thus mirrors its 20th century predecessor in function, if not in form. Researchers encounter a landscape shaped by prior decisions, even when those decisions are no longer visible. Metadata replaces marginal notes. Search filters replace physical barriers, but the logic remains unchanged. What does not align with the consolidated narrative is difficult to surface without prior knowledge that it exists. This creates a paradox for contemporary inquiry. To ask new questions, one must already suspect old omissions. But without visible prompts, suspicion rarely arises. The archive appears complete enough to discourage doubt. Completeness, in this sense, is performative rather than substantive. It signals adequacy, not exhaustiveness. The legal and ethical frameworks of the present also contribute to inertia. Modern custodians operate under mandates of neutrality and non-intervention. Revisiting unresolved lineage questions could be interpreted as speculative or revisionist without new evidence. Yet new evidence is unlikely to emerge precisely because the archive has been structured to prevent it from becoming salient. The system reinforces its own closure. Public engagement further stabilizes this condition. Visitors experience the estate as a finished story. Interpretive materials are curated for clarity and coherence. Complexity is minimized to preserve accessibility. This is not deception, it is pedagogy. But pedagogy, when repeated over generations, shapes expectation. Audiences learn what kind of history this place offers and what kind it does not. The absence of controversy becomes a credential. A site with no unresolved disputes appears authoritative. Its history seems settled. This perceived settlement discourages external challenge. Scholars, journalists, and institutions are more likely to focus on sites where tension is already visible. Silence, paradoxically, protects itself. What remains unresolved today is therefore not a single question, but a structural condition. The record continues to function without addressing its own limits. The estate's legacy persists as a synthesis of what survived administrative filtering. It is coherent, durable, and incomplete, and those qualities no longer appear contradictory. The extension of the case into the present reveals a final transformation. What was once managed silence has become historical inertia. No one actively enforces it, yet it holds. The narrative moves forward unchanged because there is no force compelling it to change. The consequence is a form of quiet permanence. The gaps do not widen, but they do not close. They remain suspended within the official account, neither acknowledged nor denied. Over time, this suspension becomes the default state of the past. The image that now defines the case is not archival, but temporal. Decades pass. Administrations change, interpretive styles evolve, yet the core narrative remains untouched. The estate endures as both artifact and authority, its stability reinforcing the sense that nothing essential is missing. This sets the stage for the final synthesis. When a legacy survives intact despite unresolved absence, the question is no longer whether something was altered or omitted. It is whether historical continuity itself can be treated as evidence, or whether endurance, when unexamined, simply becomes another mechanism of forgetting. That tension does not demand resolution here. It merely persists, embedded within the present, awaiting a moment when permanence is no longer taken as proof, and when the cost of revisiting what was never carried forward becomes lower than the cost of leaving it untouched. In the end, what endures is not the certainty of truth, but the architecture of power that decided which truths were allowed to survive. Institutions remember differently than people do. They preserve what can be stabilized, catalogued, and defended. Names that complicate order are softened, relocated, or quietly allowed to fade. Memory, in this sense, becomes a managed asset, shaped less by what happened than by what could safely remain visible. This case does not reveal a single act of erasure, but a structure, capable of absorbing absence without collapsing. The estate stands as proof of that capacity. Its walls are intact, its corridors are silent, its records are orderly, and within that order lies the distinction that defines elite history. Property is preserved meticulously, while people are preserved selectively. The building survives as a testament to continuity, even as continuity itself was carefully edited. Power rarely announces itself through destruction. It prefers adjustment. A line removed here, a reference simplified there, a document reclassified, a ledger closed, a door left unopened. Over time, these gestures no longer resemble decisions. They resemble maintenance. What was once fragile becomes institutional. What was once questionable becomes procedural. The moral weight of this history does not rest in accusation, but in recognition. When preservation prioritizes permanence over completeness, it creates a version of the past that functions smoothly while remaining unresolved. This is not the absence of truth, but its containment. A truth that is structurally suppressed does not disappear. It lingers at the edges of the record, waiting for conditions that may never arrive. As the lights dim in these halls, documents return to their boxes and keys turn softly in old locks. The system closes without resistance, confident in its coherence. The silence that follows is not empty. It is curated. It carries the echo of decisions made long ago, decisions that required no signatures once they were absorbed into routine. This is why such histories demand critical reading, not to overturn them, but to understand their shape, to notice where narratives flow too smoothly, to ask why some doors are always closed, even when no one remembers closing them. Official history often tells us what survived. It rarely tells us what was necessary to lose along the way. If this account has unsettled you, remain attentive so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if this story resonated, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Beyond these corridors, more chambers remain, and if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next one is already waiting. Some secrets survive not because they were well hidden, but because the systems that feared them learned how to endure without ever speaking. Their name